In the white-veiled silence of Dunmoreau, where the mountains never cease their whispering and the snow rests eternal, there stands an old stone tavern nestled against a frozen hillside. Its chimney smokes with a steady warmth, defying the frost that wraps the world in ice and stillness. The Hearthstone Tap. A humble name for a humble place, known to travelers of the Coldridge Pass and beyond. The tavern offered more than warmth and ale. It offered refuge, the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where even the wearied could find a moment's peace. It was run by a dwarf named Bromley Coppermantle, broad-shouldered, silver-bearded, with a heart as deep as the old mines, and a laugh that could echo off the mountain face. Bromley had once seen the world, though he rarely spoke of it now. His joy lay in the clink of mugs and the smell of roast boar, in the simple rhythm of tavern life. His son, Garin, had known no other life. Born beneath the same timber beams, raised among the barrels and benches, he was the tavern's pulse, curious, kind, and quick with a joke. At 17 winters, he was already nearly his father's height, though leaner and with eyes that wandered far beyond the frosted windows. Together, father and son lived in tune with the mountain, serving hearty meals, brewing stout ales, and listening to tales from travelers who wandered through snow and storm. It was not a life of fame or fortune, but it was good, and in its quiet way, it was enough. Until one night, it wasn't. It was late, the kind of late where even the wind had gone to sleep, and the tavern stood alone in a blanket of soft snowfall. Garin, carrying a lantern, stepped outside to latch the shutters and check the door. His breath steamed in the cold, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He turned toward the woodshed and froze. Out in the white haze, near the edge of the trees, a shape was moving, staggering, limping, a figure, broad-shouldered but hunched, shrouded in the flurries. Then it fell, a collapse, heavy and final. Garin's heart skipped. He rushed back inside to get his father. Bromley was already grabbing his coat and axe, not from fear, but from instinct. In moments they were outside, the snow swallowing their steps, lantern held high. There, in a hollow just beyond the path, lay the stranger, a young pandaren, scarcely older than Garin. His fur was matted with frost and blood, his breathing ragged, and a gash marked his brow. Around his neck, half buried in the snow, a pendant glimmered, round, metallic. Then his jaw set. "Let's get him inside." The tavern was soon warmer, the stranger wrapped in blankets, steam rising from a bowl of broth left nearby. Garin watched him anxiously. Bromley, meanwhile, paced, not with panic, but with a thoughtfulness that set Garin on edge, making him ask his father if he knew this pandaren. Bromley shook his head slowly, then looked to the pendant again. "I've heard tales, bits and pieces from travelers, about monks and symbols like this. He's pandaren, that much is clear. But this mark, it ain't nothing casual." He turned away from Garin and began stoking the fire. "Enough for tonight. We'll talk more in the morning." The pandaren awoke the morning after his rescue, disoriented but grateful. He remembered only fragments, his name, Lewin, and little else. Garin, ever curious, welcomed him with a simple meal and a growing trust. Bromley watched silently from the hearth, his eyes often drifting to the symbol that still hung around Lewin's neck. Though he said little, something in his expression betrayed deep thought. Later that day, Bromley announced his departure. There were matters in Ironforge that required his attention, and they might take time. Without ceremony, he passed the stewardship of the tavern to Garin. Lewin, still regaining his strength, offered to help however he could. Bromley gave a quiet nod, and before the sun reached its peak, he was gone. In the weeks that followed, the tavern lived and breathed under new hands. The snowfall came and went in gentle cycles, and travelers continued to pass through. Lewin proved to be a gifted cook, blending Dwarven staples with spices and techniques that seemed to come from instinct more than memory. Garen, always hungry for stories of the outside world, began experimenting with brewing. He tried methods he'd only heard about in passing: dry hopping, fruit infusions, barrel aging, each inspired by the travelers who sat by the fire and shared pieces of the world they had seen. Together, Garen and Lewin transformed the Hearthstone tap into something more than it had ever been before. But Bromley did not return. One morning, while tending to the old study above the tavern's cellar, Garen discovered a narrow compartment hidden behind a dusty beam. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth, lay a weathered journal. It was his father's. Most of the entries were sparse, scattered notes from past travels. But one page stood out, a detailed sketch of the symbol Lewin wore around his neck. Beneath it, a line of dwarvish script warned of a group called the Wandering Clan. The journal described them as martial monks, once trained under the Jadefire Accord, rumored to have aligned with the Horde. Dangerous, the note read. When Garen showed the page to Lewin, the pandaren stood in silence for a long time. Though his memories remained clouded, something in him stirred, a sense of unease. No words were needed. They both knew what had to be done. The Hearthstone tap would not close forever, but the time had come for answers. About Bromley, about Lewin, and about the strange thread of fate tying them together. They packed lightly. On the tavern door, Garen pinned a note written in a simple hand. Gone brewing, back when the barrels return. And just like that, they stepped into the cold light of morning, leaving behind the warmth of the tavern and walking toward the unknown and the truth that waited somewhere beyond the frost-covered hills of Dun Moreau. When they locked the door to the Hearthstone tap, neither Garen nor Lewin truly knew what lay beyond the edge of Dun Moreau. For years, stories had passed through their walls. Tales of kingdoms, heroes and beasts. But stories were all they'd ever known. Now, with packs on their backs and their breath misting in the early chill, they stepped into those very stories. Their first goal was Ironforge. Though Garen had seen its glow from afar on clear nights, he'd never walked its winding stone path, never stood beneath its mountain gate. And when they reached it, they stopped in awe. The gates of Ironforge rose from the cliffside like the carved face of a god. Two towering statues flanked the entry. Long-bearded, hammer-bearing dwarves, immortalized in stone. Above them, great fire bowls crackled, casting light over carvings etched into the very heart of the mountain. Neither Garen nor Lewin spoke. There was nothing to say. Inside, the world shifted. Steam hissed from grates. The smell of metal and stone and soot filled the air. Dozens, no, hundreds, of people moved through the halls. Dwarves of every kind, merchants in leather aprons, guards in gleaming mail, children darting across bridges above molten forges. Garen whispered, almost reverently, "I didn't know it was real." Lewin said nothing, but his wide eyes said enough. They wandered for hours. Garen was too overwhelmed to ask questions. Lewin absorbed everything with quiet intensity, as if echoes of his past were hiding in the stone. Later, tucked away in a quieter corner of the forlorn cavern, they finally sat and breathed. They hadn't seen Bromley. They hadn't even searched. The city had swallowed them. They were exhausted from their travel and decided to call it a night and keep exploring first thing in the morning. The next few days were slower, more intentional. They asked questions. Tavern keepers, couriers, even a jeweler who recognized the Coppermantle name. Eventually, a weapons merchant remembered. Bromley had passed through. He bought a long-handled axe and asked about ships from Menethil Harbor, southbound. It was something. They joined a Dwarven caravan heading east towards the wetlands, where the Menethil Harbor is. Garen couldn't sleep, thoughts racing. Lewin grew quieter still, fingers drifting more often to the pendant around his neck. Menethil met them with wind and rain, a dock town of wet stone, creaking timber, and the ever-present smell of salt. There at last they found it, a cargo record, a name on the ledger, Bromley Coppermantle, outbound, destination, Booty Bay. It was the first truth they had touched with their own hands. Lewin stood at the edge of the pier, watching the ship that would carry them out of the familiar. Garen stepped beside him, both scared, but determined. They stepped aboard the giant ship. The travel across the ocean was dark and ruthless, strong wind and waves crashing into the sides of the ship for days on end. Then suddenly it was quiet, and they could feel the warmth of the sun above and hear the sound of seabirds. They had arrived in Booty Bay. Booty Bay was louder than they expected, not just in sound, but in spirit. Goblins shouted prices. Crates slammed against damp planks. The smell of salt and oil hung heavy. Even the sails seemed to groan. Compared to this, Ironforge had been a sanctuary. They didn't linger long. In a back alley tavern, they met a goblin named Zik, who traded answers for gold. He remembered Bromley. The dwarf had come asking about Pandaria, monks, and old orders. Zik tapped Lewin's pendant and narrowed his eyes. "You don't want what's at the end of that path, kid. That mark? It's old and cursed." They nervously looked at each other, but there was no going back now. They had to continue their quest for answers. The voyage to Pandaria was long, storm-tossed and strange. The land that met them was nothing like what they'd known. Thick air, ancient trees, the kind of silence that seemed to breathe. Lewin was quiet, but each step forward sparked something deeper. Recognition. Echoes. In Half Hill, they found the trail they needed. Monks spoke in riddles, but they pointed toward Kunlai, to an abandoned monastery, once tied to a name long whispered. The Jadefire Accord. They climbed, and there it was. A structure built into the cliffs, veiled in cloud and memory. Inside, they found what Bromley had found. Records of the Jadefire Accord. Not just a sect of martial monks, but a splintered order obsessed with reclaiming balance through dominance. When the war ended, they vanished, but a handful remained, hidden, still loyal to the old ways. And among the scrolls, they found Bromley's note. "They found me before I found them. They know about the boy. I told them he was gone. I told them he was safe. They wouldn't believe me, so I stayed. To delay, to distract. If you're reading this, I bought you time." "He was here," Garen whispered. "I can't believe he was actually here." They pushed deeper into the cliffs, to a forgotten outpost where snow never melted and time barely moved. There, behind rusted gates, they found him. Bromley sat weak in a cell, not tortured, but contained. The Jadefire remnants hadn't killed him. They hadn't dared. He was a Coppermantle, a name still spoken with caution. But more than that, he knew things. He had convinced them the Accord could not rise again if blood was spilled. He had become their captive and their keeper. There was no battle, no heroic charge, just a conversation by torchlight. Garen spoke. Lewin stood tall, and the monks, tired of waiting for a future that never came, listened. They let Bromley go. That night, far from the cliffs, the three of them sat by a fire in the grasslands. Garen, looked at his father and asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Bromley stared into the flames. "Because you deserved a peaceful life, not this legacy, not these choices." Lewin's voice was low, certain. "But we chose each other, even when we didn't know why." They said little after that, but the silence was no longer hollow. 3 figures sat by the fire. A father who had sacrificed, a son who had searched, and a brother who had been feared. And none of them were alone anymore. The hearthstone tap had grown still in their absence. Dust clung to the rafters. Barrels sat undisturbed in the cellar. But it stood, as sturdy as ever. Together, they reopened it. The first to arrive were the old regulars, dwarves hunting the woods and working the mines nearby. Then came curious travelers drawn by rumor. Then came the tales, that the food was richer, the ale sharper, the air warmer. Lewin brewed tea in the mornings, rich with pandaren spice. Garin perfected a dark stout aged in mountain barrels. Bromley took his old seat by the hearth, smoking his pipe and grumbling that the lad had overhopped the amber again. More and more people started coming to the tavern. Tales of the three's heroic travels were wandering in the winds through Azeroth. The pendant Lewin once hid now hung behind the bar, encased in glass. A relic of something dangerous, and now, finally, peaceful. A quiet sign of the brotherly bond that had been forged. Garin was asked once what had happened on the road, why they vanished, why they returned. He paused, looked to his father and pandaren brother, laughing together in the other side of the tavern, and answered simply, "We found something worth coming back for." Years passed, seasons turned, and one day, travelers stepped into the tavern and found something new. A sign hung above the hearth. Hand-carved. Simple. Honest. The 3 copper mantles. It wasn't just a name. It was a truth earned, a family, and a bond forged across differences that could never be broken.